Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. It's good to be here with you at OC Talk Radio. Paul, today's subject is not a light one. In fact, it may be one of the most troubling subjects I have discussed on the show in more than 130 episodes. Today is about the very deep human pain and suffering, and, however, the potential learning that can result if one chooses to take that path. Although we may love learning about life and about our deepest inner selves, the path there is most often unpleasant. David Whyte alludes to the power of suffering when he writes, "Suffering is an inescapable and inevitable as breathing. If suffering is inescapable and inevitable, it might be asking us to see suffering as our constant and instructive companion. Suffering asks us not to look for an alternative path, because there is no alternative path." Now, none of this eludes the pain and despair of suffering. It is not something we anticipate with glee. In fact, it sucks. Yet suffering is inescapable. We are asked not only to expect it and learn from it, but actually to embrace it as an unwanted, instructive companion. Now, my very special guest today, Dr. John Bash, is most accustomed to suffering as well as the deep learning that comes from it. As a successful minister and church planter, in John's resume I read, and this is really a great quote, "John's heart for leaders is a natural growth of a life spent watching God turn pain and tragedy into comfort and healing." What a brilliant statement. It's our path is one of a life spent watching God turn pain and tragedy into comfort and suffering, which was also the life of Christ, was one of suffering and pain and tragedy, which turned into comforting, healing, and salvation. Now, John was a church planter that spread churches from the East Coast to the West, with one in Chicago, and his unlikely story was always highlighted by what John calls two sides. He writes, "Often it is in the secret, vulnerable pain and assessment behind our stories that we find the deeper truth. Grace is more than a concept." John's story has given him a passion for those affected by abuse, addictions, tragedy, and pain. So with all of that wonderful introduction, let's bring on John and benefit enormously from his life and teachings. John, welcome to the show, my friend. I really look forward to our time together.
Charlie, you know I always enjoy chatting and meandering with you and never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, it was really funny. As we were talking before the show, I always talk to my guests before the show. You said, "Where is this going?" And I said, "I can't say." And he said, "What do you mean I can't say?" Well, first of all, I refuse to say what that may be. And second of all, I have no idea where it's going to go. The conversation is going to take us where it's going to go. Now, I have my narrative arc, I have my questions, but I allow the show to be very conversational, and that we take it where the show allows. And if I tried to tell you where the show is going to go, it would sort of destroy the impromptu-ness, the excitement of what we're trying to do. Before we go down deep, I want to talk about your history as a successful minister and a church planter. You got to tell me, what is a church planter?
You know, it's funny, in the world of evangelical churches, it's a common term. And the rest of the world, people just like, really? They picture you out digging in the fields. And, you got to remember, I actually haven't been a local church pastor for almost 20 years now. But when I was younger, I was in a denomination that you either started a church or you were kind of stuck because there were more ministers than there were churches. And so basically, it was going into areas that either needed, churches of one kind or another, or churches that just didn't have, or areas that didn't have churches. And you started from scratch. And I didn't really know how to do it. It happened spontaneously. I just was teaching, and there were a group of people that said we needed a church. So that was my beginning, and I did best when I didn't know what I was doing. Once I thought I knew what I was doing and took a few courses in church planting, it didn't work anymore.
Boy, how true is that our educational system often becomes either a roadblock or a distraction. But you talked about, I want to know a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of it. You said you started teaching. Well, who'd you start teaching to? Were you on the street corner saying, come and visit me at my home? Or did you make relationships? What was the process all about?
Charlie, it was strange. I moved to Chicago for my master's, to go to what I thought were the best professors in the country. I wasn't going to go by name. I was going to go by who had the best professors. And I ended up in Chicago, and they had this group that met in the Salvation Army, not Salvation Army sponsored, but they rented this place. It was just single people in Chicago who were Christians. And I went there, and it was fun. I was single, and I was a Christian, and they asked me, they figured out, this guy's getting a seminary degree, let him teach. And I taught one of the 7 classes, and it grew, and I ended up becoming a leader in that organization. And a lot of those people couldn't find a church in Chicago that really fit them. So that was the beginning.
That's interesting. And we're really talking in this language, we're really talking church planting, like you said earlier, you alluded to earlier, is Protestant evangelicalism, because there is no church planting of an Episcopal church. You're going to go out and, the denomination will find the church for you. So this is really sort of evangelical or Protestantism. Is it not?
In general, that's true. The mainline denominations as a whole are shrinking very rapidly. And so there's oftentimes more churches than there are people. So you see churches closing. And in a place like downtown Chicago, some of these beautiful churches were turning into beautiful condos. And I hated to see that happen. So in this case, I happen to be part of a Presbyterian denomination that was very conservative. And so they didn't have any churches like that. And I was going around, and it was easy for us to rent church buildings because existing congregations, major like Stone Cathedral kind of places, would have 8 people on a Sunday morning. And this particular church, we ended up buying a Polish Orthodox cathedral where the people had kind of moved into the suburbs. And it was just amazing. It was formal a church as you can possibly imagine.
It was like when I went to, this was 25 years ago, I went to London, and I went to an Anglican church in London. And it was a magnificent church, but like you said, there might have been 8 or 10 people. And with the Episcopal liturgy, they read their bulletins during the homily or the sermon, because that was not really part of the liturgy. They were there for the body and blood of Christ, for communion. They were not there to listen to some guy talk.
Right.
And it was really humorous that when the preacher got up to preach, they opened up their bulletins and started reading. It's just as if this is not it, but. Things have certainly changed, and do you think church planting is a discipline now in the United States? I know internationally it's huge, but in the United States, do you think church planting is still a strong option?
I do think the whole church world is fascinating. In terms of what it actually is right now, there is a crisis, whether it's mainline churches or conservative evangelical churches. There's a crisis going on because of what you know as the nones, N-O-N-E-S. The major, fastest growing portion of the population in a spiritual sense are those who don't identify with any church. And I don't think we know what that's going to mean for the culture, because we're in a generation now where many children, I don't know where you want to define the line, but a whole generation of children who did not grow up in the church. So they don't ask the question any longer, where do I go to church, at all. And the church doesn't know what to do with that yet. How do they reach people who really aren't even asking the question, should they go to church? They've kind of decided, it's not relevant for my life.
And it's not only them that I found, John. It is the people that have attended conservative church no longer can buy into the doctrine, because the doctrine is still a 3,000-year-old doctrine that rejects many social groups now. And I'm finding, if I may use the term millennials, we were talking about millennials that just simply don't go to church. They don't want to go to church. And as Paul has brought up to me several times, the millennials also don't declare political party. They don't say independent any longer. They just say undeclared, because they simply don't like what's going on in the country. And something is bound to happen. I'm like you. I have no idea what is going to happen, but something is bound to happen.
I think generationally, Charlie, as you and I we're old, and we never thought we were going to be old. I remember years ago when Paul McCartney turned 63. That was such a big deal, because when he wrote a song about turning
when I'm 64,
it was 64. There you go. I don't even have the year right, but when he wrote that, it was like. It was like, that's an infinite old person. I'm never going to get there.
It is.
And as you watch these guys, I went and saw the Rolling Stone a handful of years ago, and I'm looking at a 70-year-old man bounce around the stage like he's a kid. But there are these generational changes that we're really having, I think, can have a difficulty in a way we haven't before, because our basic assumptions about really, really important things, not about music style and clothing, but about what a man and a woman is. That's a pretty big deal. We're talking about the very beginning definition of mankind as the Bible describes it, and God created man and male and female created him, and now all of a sudden you say that and you're politically controversial. If anybody had said to me a few years ago that saying that God created man as male and female would be controversial, I would say, come on, can't go that far. And yet it is. It's a huge issue in our culture today, and that's really impossible for people, 10, 20 years older than me. They just they knock their heads and say, this makes no sense.
Well, look at one of the, I don't know, largest, but certainly most prominent denominations. The Methodists are splitting over gay marriage. They just decided, the conservatives decided, and the non-conservatives decided, we cannot come to resolve on this. And so the church, I've been keeping up with the newspaper, the church is doing a split by April, is it, or something like that?
That is just one illustration. You can take any denomination. You say Methodist, I'll just take Presbyterians, for example. The average person thinks that Presbyterians are just one group. In fact, there's, at least 12 significant Presbyterian denominations, and you could define each of them by their attitude toward sexuality and Christian leadership relative to maleness and femaleness, and marriage relative to maleness and femaleness. And largely, they just keep splitting because one wants to say, well, we want women in leadership, but we don't think women should marry each other. And you could just divide all those denominations just by those issues.
Isn't that funny that gender issues, and I'm very familiar with gender issues, but this was the first time I have thought of marriage issues as being as being, what is the role of the male and the female in marriage? And in the very conservative tradition, the male is supposed to be, I think misinterpreted Scripture, but the male is supposed to be the strong head of the family, and the woman is supposed to kowtow to that. But
you don't believe that?
No.
Oh.
God, if I did, my wife would kick my ass.
That's why you're still married, Charlie.
Pam would never put up with that, and she's more conservative than I am. As I was reading through your resume, let's kind of move on. That was an interesting little sidetrack there, but as we're talking about suffering, but
a natural segue into suffering now, maleness and femaleness.
But that is suffering. I mean, if people truly suffer, there's a spiritual suffering that is going on. You don't have a church split without suffering.
Big time.
And these people that are involved in it are really hurt by it because they want it. I read between the lines that they want to stay together, but they just can't. They just can't doctrinally stay together. It just does not work. And we can certainly get into that subject, but that is not the subject for today. But I did read something that you put in your resume that you sent to me. You said something I don't know that I agree with about you. You said that your pedigree, based on your life's experience, was not one that would predictably end up as a minister, that your pedigree would not end up as a minister. Yet it seems to me, John, that you have the perfect personal history to be a pastor. That you care deeply for people under your leadership. You care deeply for people that are around your life. We just talked today about somebody that's involved in your life, and your compassion for this person who is suffering right now was just obvious. So explain that to me. I mean, don't you think your pedigree is actually more of a pedigree inclined toward ministry and serving people and serving the needs of people than not?
I'm doing the stereotype from my childhood, which is if you saw a minister and met him and asked him what it was, he probably grew up in a spiritual home, a church-attending home, and went to Sunday school and all of that. And for me, that wasn't pedigree, the story. Yeah, I grew up in an unchurched home. I remember my parents, when we moved, when I was in third grade, checking out churches, and they didn't take us with them. And I thought they were going to choose a church we'd go, but my father went to the one down the street for 4 weeks, and when the minister didn't know his name after 4 weeks, he's like, forget this, a church is just about money. And he had other reasons that he chose not to go to church, not the least of which I think he preferred a beer. But if you look at that, and as well as look at the fact that my mother died when I was 3. I had a stepmother who was hostile to the faith.
But you read that she seemed to be hostile toward you as well.
Yes, that's true. Unfortunately, my father married somebody he loved me deeply, but he married somebody I think really in many ways without the capacity to love. She was so damaged from her childhood. So I ended up really as a teenager having no specific belief in God or knowledge of the Bible or any of those things. So that's why I say you're probably least likely. I have a very unloving mother. I have an alcoholic father. I don't have a church background. How in the world do you get a minister out of that?
And my response, practically speaking, is that is the pedigree of a good minister.
Well,
somebody who understands life, knows the brokenness of life, and just in your conversation right there was empathy, even for this mother who was, if I may use the word, abusive or not relational with you. you did not cast blame on her. The first thing you did is said she didn't have the capacity because of the way she was raised. She was limited in what she could do. See, that's from the heart of a pastor. That's not from the heart of a judgmentalist.
That's probably the most gracious I've ever spoken about it, and it felt good.
If I got you in another mood, you could have had some other words to say for
exactly. Not the minister words.
Yeah, the B word. Yeah. I don't know if you recall. My guess is you do. But the first time we met, you invited me to speak at a church group. I can't remember the topic, don't even want to remember the topic. But I know that we hit it off in that our unusual theologies or non-conventional theologies seem to track, that we seem to track with each other, and we could have these nice conversations, and I felt there was somebody else in the faith tradition that thought as oddly as I did. But then we lost contact until recently, once again, we met at what I'm calling a meeting of broken people.
Yep.
And we discovered our mutual brokenness that was similar yet distinct, because they're always similar yet distinct. And that was a sense of bonding from that, from our mutual brokenness. There is a bonding in that. Would you agree?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about it.
In our conversations, we're now going to go deep, and I'm going to ask you to tell me a story. In our conversations, it seemed to me that you finally ended up in this meeting of broken people initially as a result of a most tragic event that occurred in the life of your son, Johnny. Would you like to tell us about that and explore what happened to Johnny and what that was about? Tell us about Johnny before the accident and after the accident.
Yeah, it's funny, even when you said, would you like to, there's part of me that I kind of hate the memories and I hate telling the stories, because it's just, I identified as just a painful time that I don't want to revisit. But reality is, for me, I had been out of the ministry for a while, working as a consultant and working with churches, helping them raise support for things, and life was kind of cruising along, but I got a phone call, and it's the phone call no parent wants to get, and it was Johnny had a girlfriend, and she just said, Dr. Bash, Johnny's been in an accident, and he wants to talk to you. And she seemed kind of confused by why my son would want to talk to me, and I didn't know the scenario, but it ends up the scenario was my son was being held out of the river that out by Lake Havasu. He was being held out of the river by a man, and his girlfriend was holding the phone to his ear, and he said just like this, hey, Dad, in a normal tone of voice. And he said, I can't feel my body. And of course, my heart sunk, and I tend to be one that gets really calm in emergency type things. But in any case, Johnny had dove off a boat, put his head in the sandbar. He was 28 years old, at the peak of his physical appearance, gym body. I think as handsome as he'd ever been in his life, excelling in his career. And just one dive off a boat and head into, he couldn't see in the water. The sandbar was just a few feet under the surface, and his spinal cord snapped, and he immediately became a quadriplegic. And it was only a handful of hours before we found that out. And it changed everybody's life. And so for me to understand suffering, there's a sense of really, it's Johnny's the one who went through this, and yet at the same time, one of the things we find about suffering is it's not just us; it's the people around us. And I discovered that pretty quickly, that the parents of children who've been paralyzed have an extremely high rate of suicide. And man, I really understand that, because it certainly for me, I had a hard time getting out of bed in the morning and going to the bathroom to start my day, because at that point I realized everything I'd done my son couldn't do.
You showed me when we were sitting in the club before this, you showed me a before and after photograph of Johnny, and as you recall my response, I just said, I don't want to see it. I just, I want to ignore that, because I picture my son, because your son, there's similarities between them, and dark hair and with a gym build, and see if that were to happen to my son, I can certainly understand the suicide rate of parents, because your child, even a child that's not close, that doesn't feel close on the surface, is likely the closest thing to you in your life. The most dear thing to you does that? Am I correct on that? I'm making an assumption on that, John.
No, there's no doubt. I even always said, just emotionally, there's a sense that my daughter and I were closer, but still there was a sense with my son that, it really was kind of an old style. He's my firstborn son. I mean, he's it, man. And I'll never forget the first moment of fatherhood I felt was when he was really basically just, his head was peeking out, and the doctor stuck a little needle in his head to get a blood. And I got that fatherly sense of, really, you are pinching my son, and I was like ready to punch out the doctor. But I really don't tell, this is embarrassing. I don't know if I've told this before, but one of the things that happened was about less than a year later, we were wondering how we were going to deal with this, because they told us the numbers of how expensive it would be for a quadriplegic to have a life. And it was way beyond anything my brain could comprehend. And they're like, yeah, for the rest of your life, there's going to be this amount of money on top of a regular person. And so anyway, we had a golf event, kind of a golf fundraiser. And I got somebody who had worked with me in doing big events and did a major event. And I just kind of assumed that I would speak to all these people. I mean, friends of mine came from all over the country to be part of this and to be supportive. And then this man who I'd asked to coordinate the event, when it came to speaking, he said, really, we're going to ask Johnny's mom to speak, not you. And I was quite taken back. And I realized pretty quickly that I'd asked this man to do it because I trusted him and he was a good leader. And he was giving me hard words. The reason they weren't asking me to speak, because they weren't confident I wouldn't have too much to drink. And that's pretty embarrassing for somebody with my background and with what I knew. I got to the place that I just had to numb the pain of what was going on, and I tried to do it with alcohol. And I look at that, and I tell you, there's another side of suffering, and we'll probably get to it, but most people probably have no idea, can't picture what Johnny's life was like.
You don't think of that, do you? I mean, you when you're in the midst of your suffering, it is it's not necessarily egotistical, but you just can't get out of yourself. Yourself is so involved in this situation that you can't get out of it. It's like, and this is the next step to it, I know a couple of moms that have lost their children at 30 years old, that just simply, one never recovered and she's died now. This was a few dozen years ago, and one quite recently. Her son will never live her life, never leave her life. This is, and she's got 2 wonderful daughters. She loves her daughters, takes care of her daughters, but her son, it's just overwhelming what she feels with his son. What do you think is going on? Why are we as parents taking it that way? And they've never seemed like they were in our entire life growing up, that we had other parts of our life, and yet when something tragic happens, it seems there's nothing else in our life but that child.
It's interesting how when we talk about how we know things, we talk about sometimes about what's innate. What really do we just have innately? It's not like we've learned it or we've gotten it even from experience or perception around us. And I think some of those things, I believe that one of those things is actually an understanding of God. I think beneath all the ways we can come to a conclusion there's a God, I think that's really put within us. Well, it's put in us in the same way I believe the parent-child connection. In fact, Jesus even makes reference to at one point talking about, which of you, if your son asked for food, for a piece of bread, would give him a snake. It's just, what a silly, of course. We just say that's dumb. One would never do that. How we care as parents, it's just built into who we are.
Since you brought God into the equation,
He likes to get there, by the way.
What's that?
God just likes to get there. He keeps interrupting our lives in amazing ways.
He does, and I want to pursue more of God's involvement in this. But first, John, I was just signaled it's time for a break.
Cool.
So we're going to take a quick break and come right back to this. Hi, this is Charlie Hedges, and you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie, and I'm here with Dr. John Bash, and we are talking about, which we haven't gotten to yet, but the lessons learned from suffering. But before we do that, we need to continue to understand suffering at a greater degree, and one of the things we ended off before the break was, and I wanted to ask, did you feel resentment toward God in this process?
Charlie, I had a very active and conscious relationship with God since I was a teenager. And because of that, when this happened, I'm not one who acts like God was verbally speaking to me, but it was literally as if God said to me, you're not going to blame me for this one. And it really took a relief off the situation. It's like, yeah, I know enough to know that God's not going to take the hit for it. We live in a world that tragedies happen. It's just part of life. And so I really was able to skip that stage, and that softened the blow a bit. I knew that I could struggle and ask questions in my relationship with God, but I wasn't going to sit there and act like I was uniquely singled out in this case.
That's not a normal response.
But I didn't have a normal background. I already been walking with God for 30-some years at that point. Actually, for over 40 years.
And you had already experienced several forms of suffering and tragedy in your life before this.
I'd blame God for so many things. It's like, okay, you've blamed me for enough. Don't waste your time blaming me for this one.
That's a really interesting take on it, and I think can be helpful to people that God's involvement in this, and what degree is God involved or disinvolved or uninvolved? Does God allow? Does God promote? You know what? I mean, there's so many questions that have to come to your mind in this situation.
It would be fun sometime just to delve into all of the will of God kind of issues. I think for me, I was in so much pain. I was just looking for really how do I get through the day, and how do I help my son in whatever way I could, and clearly trying to numb my own pain in the bottle didn't work. So I was able to get to the place where it was very plain to me that that was no longer going to be an option for me, and that a full acceptance, not just of Johnny's accident, but of other things that had gone on in my life, that it really was another chapter. It wasn't just that the part of Johnny's story we haven't told is the life that he ended up having. It wasn't just he was going to be a miracle in the life post-paralysis, but that there were some things to be done and changed, in a soft use of the term miracle. There were some miracles to happen in my life as well.
Yeah, what about Johnny? How did he respond? And in general, in this situation, was he angry? Was he? I mean, what were the kinds of emotions that he experienced? I can't imagine.
Yeah, he's a great contrast. He did it right, I did it wrong, right? I'm the dad, I do it wrong. I'm the one with the theology degrees and the supposed answers. He's the kid out there, building houses and doing mortgages, and yet it took him a week, in my opinion, to figure it out. I should define, I guess, a little bit. When I talk about quadriplegic, I had no idea what's a quadriplegic, what's a paraplegic. You don't understand categories of paralysis until you face it. And basically what it was he was a C6 fracture. And what that means is that basically he has no use of his body below his breasts, and movement of his arms just down to his wrists. And so here he was, I'm thinking, so he's basically going to be a vegetable in a bed for the rest of his life. But for him, as he discovered, he's like, oh, so this is the body I've been given. I have these additional physical and financial challenges now in life. Let's get going. And I was watching it. I couldn't quite fathom. I'd see him making decisions that just blew me away. His friends showed up. I call it like Harrier jets taking off from the ground. I've always been proud of my friends, and Johnny's seen throughout my life my friends and how proud I was of them. And he's kind of like, Dad, I have some friends too. I learned how to make friends. Check out mine. And they came in and they transformed our house in the things that need to be done to accommodate him. His cars were sold. New cars were bought. And he, in a very short period of time, after 5 months in the hospital, he got up and he got a wheelchair that was custom designed basically for paraplegic, even though he's a quadriplegic. And he runs around and he started 3 businesses. He's an amazing designer, builder of homes and Airbnbs. Just an amazing guy. Well, it took me 1.5 years of drinking too much to figure out that I didn't just need to numb the pain. If I would accept what had happened the way Johnny did, I might be able to get on with life. And that's, in fact, what happened.
What do you think gave him the capacity to do that?
I love it when people give me credit. Oh, you was a good dad. It must be because of you. And I really agree with them. It doesn't resonate at all. I can't imagine what the connection is. I would say God gave him a grace. He has become a model. When he goes back to the hospital that he stayed at for so many months with people who are newly paralyzed, the nurses will bring out their new patients to see Johnny drive up. And I don't know if you caught that, Charlie, but I said, Johnny, drive up. And they keep looking for who was driving the car. And it's Johnny. And it's a beautiful car. And he flies in and out of that thing on a ramp. And he's just an encouragement that there's life after paralysis. And I think for a lot of us, we need that message. It may not be paralysis, but I think most people have been hit in the head pretty good by something.
A paralysis of some sort.
Oh, yeah. I don't know anybody, really. You even mentioned in the church of people who've been part of the church and how many of them aren't now. Why? If you ask them why, it's because of some kind of pain. They had deep disappointments or people violated them in some way. There's tons of things that if we don't find ways to accept those things and come to grips with them, there's an infinite number of things that can ruin our life and cause deep, searing pain.
Do you think, in line with our topic, that, I like your line. I was just looking through my notes, and I like your line early on that we have a life spent watching God turning pain and tragedy into comfort and healing. Mm-hmm. And there is a transference there, and there is a learning. What types of things do we learn about ourselves through suffering?
I think, I guess because I had just made a reference to that, I think we'll put it this way. There was a man who wrote to me because of Facebook. He saw quickly that's not what had happened to Johnny. And he's a guy who had been in my church. I didn't know him really well. I just remember I liked him. And he just wrote me a note on Facebook 10 years after I'd seen him. And he said, I think you want to call me. And it was kind of a elusive message. And so I called him, and he's like, John, it's great to hear from you. He said, there's a few things you don't know that happened since you knew me. He had a wife who was dying of cancer, and he was helping her. And he was on the way home from work on a motorcycle. Car cut him off. He flew 10 yards in the air. And he was in a coma for 8 months. His family was standing around basically answering the question, should we pull the plug? And they're arguing, he wouldn't like to live like this. I know, Dave, da-da-da. He ended up communicating somehow with his wife, who's dying of cancer. She sees, and it's like, wait a minute. He can hear, something's going on. Well, here he is calling me, talking to me, saying, I'm a quadriplegic, John. I think I can help you. I talked to that man every day for the next year. He held my hands. What I learned in the midst of that, here's a man who's a quadriplegic I couldn't talk to almost anybody else, Charlie, because nobody could understand that kind of pain except somebody who had been through it. And it was him, and it was another friend I had who had lost a child. And that, for me, I literally climbed on top of Johnny's bed early on and just looked at him and said, Johnny, your body sucks, but you're here. I have you. And I realized somehow in the midst of this pain, it's out of our pain that we can help others. It's not that we have it all together.
And you are suggesting, what I'm hearing you suggesting is the power of relationship. It is you do not deal with this, you do not manage it, and you do not accept it all alone. It is with the help and care and love of other people that is sort of a primary factor in our healing process. Did I catch you right in saying that?
But how much do we not want to hear that answer? I mean, how much when when you're going through trouble and people say you ought to go to a support group, what do you want to do? You want to say, go fly a kite. I no more want to go to a support group than fly to the moon. You're a lunatic. I'm hurting. I'd rather go meditate on the mountaintop and say, give me the answer of the monks. Somehow give me the answer out of the sky. And I don't know about you, Charlie, but that's not the way I find God working. I mean, God seems to work through other people who've been through the same kind of stuff and who can understand it. And And
a God who has gone through that himself.
Oh, it's crazy. Why? Who in the world would tell the story of a suffering Savior? God's going to come. If God's going to come, think about it. I mean, if I'm God and I'm going to come to the world, it's going to be a Superman movie, man. Yeah. But do you know how they make Superman relatable? You end up seeing his struggles. If you really get into Superman
flaws.
movies,
yeah.
You see
his kryptonite.
Exactly. He's struggling in pain. That's what makes it real. And now we have literally a Savior who goes through suffering in every way as we have.
Through his whole life, not just through the cross, his whole life he was rejected. You know, we talk about how he was accepted by the masses and loved by the masses, but by the influential people of the world, he was highly rejected. And he was rejected by his family, by his hometown.
Look at the temptation stories. They talk about Jesus and his temptations of the devil. Go back and read those things. Those are things that's like, really? You just do this and you can have all the fun you want. Those temptations were real. I'd like, hey, I like this deal. I thought the devil was a good negotiator. I would have bought into some of those, right? Yeah, I could do all those things. I'll take that instead of a cross.
Look, as we wrap up, I'm realizing, we could go on, but it's about time to wrap up. But I did have an extended statement that I made to kind of wrap us up, and that your life reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. You have a family heritage of alcoholism, parental abuse on the part of your stepmom, if not your dad, I don't know. The loss of your birth mother early in your life. You have a daughter who has struggled with addiction. And you've had personal issues with alcohol. Hell, with all that, I can see no better reason than to turn to truly the wonderful numbing advantages of drink. There is, we always put down drink, but there is an advantage to being numbed, and an advantage of just not having to deal with it. I just want to put it aside, and that's what drink does until other problems arise and we find out that the numbing is not really working. But there is a numbing process that is quite necessary. And yet, John, after all of that you've been through, I find that you are one of the kindest, most appreciative, and supportive men that I know. Mm-hmm. What the hell is that all about?
Well, that's gracious, Charlie. As sure as who I'd like to be. I can't believe sometimes what a sinful turkey I am. But I will say this, in the midst of it, I'm not a Christian because I grew up as one. I'm not one because it's politically correct, because it's getting to be really non-politically correct. And I'm not one because I don't think. My degree's in philosophy, and I continue to love to think at the highest levels. But when you get down to it, science doesn't provide these answers. It just explains what God created. I have a Savior, and Jesus in my life is real in the hard stuff, and has loved me when I felt so unlovable, and I need that daily. That wasn't something that just happened to me as a teenager. Every day I need to say, I'm making the decision to take his view on things. And he said, in this world you will have tribulation, but I have overcome the world. It's a kind of cool way to start a day.
And that's a kind of cool way to end our time together. That's a wonderful statement. I hope our listeners are not just caught in the deeply tragic events of your life, but the hope and the recovery, the compassion, the love, the support for others that you have gained as a result of this suffering, and that it is encouragement to all of us. I want to thank you. Dr. Pastor John, what final words do you have for us regarding the inevitability of suffering and the unexpected yet necessary life learnings that result?
Yeah, we need to quit being surprised by suffering. It's going to come. What are we going to do when it comes? And hopefully along the way, we're going to be a little more sensitive towards those who are going through stuff that we don't relate to because we haven't gone through it yet. But we can do something and not give people answers. We can hold their hand. We can hug them. And, Charlie, I'm glad I'm here with you because I'm a little less scared about life because I love you and you love me, and we know that makes a difference.
That makes a difference. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, and you have been both inspirational and instructive. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in to The Next Chapter with Charlie, and be sure to check us out at our website, thenextchapter.life. Until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.